Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, The Making of Oaxacalifornia as Seen Through Expressive Cultural Forms of Second-Generation Oaxacan Youth, presented by Professor Xóchitl Chavez. I'm Evan Graves, Assistant Director here at the Yale Institute of Sacred Music, and we are very pleased you could join us today for what will surely be a fascinating presentation. Before we introduce today's speakers, I wanted to mention that we will have time for some questions and answers after the talk. And you can type in any of those questions by clicking on the Q&A icon that you're going to find at the bottom of the webinar screen. And please feel free to add your questions at any point during the talk, and we will answer as many as possible at the end of the presentation, which should go for roughly 45 minutes. So we should have a fair amount of time for questions. So with that, I am very happy to pass the microphone over to Dr. Bernard Gordillo, a fellow here at the Yale Institute of Sacred Music, and he will be introducing today's speaker. Over to you.
Thank you, Evan. Good afternoon, everyone. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Xóchitl Chavez, who is the first tenure-track Chicanx assistant professor in the Department of Music at the University of California, Riverside. She is a scholar of expressive culture and performance, specializing in indigenous communities from southern Mexico and transnational migration. Her current work focuses on second-generation Zapotec brass bands in Los Angeles, California, and transborder relationships with their communities of origin in Oaxaca, Mexico. Dr. Chávez's forthcoming book, entitled Guelaguetza Oaxacan Migrant Festivals and the Making of Transborder Indigeneity, documents the lived and performative movements of how Oaxacan communities in Los Angeles and Santa Cruz, California, reproduce the annual Guelaguetza Festival, one of the most renowned indigenous celebrations of communal dances and musical forms. Her book will be out by the end of 2024 with the University of Oxford University Press. And over to you, Dr. Chavez. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I greatly appreciate this. Just give me a few moments as we all start to DJ through our slides. So, un cordial y afectuoso saludos a todos presentes. I wanted to thank Ray Vogel, Eben Graves, and the dear friend Bernard Gordillo for the gracious invitation to speak to the students of Yale Institute of Sacred Music and the larger community that's listening in today from various parts of the United States. Before I begin my talk, I want to acknowledge and publicly express my gratitude to various Oaxacan migrant communities across California and in Oaxaca, Mexico, for allowing me into their homes to be and attend and participate in their music and dance practices, as well as being part of and witnessing the Guelaguetza Festivals for over 15 years. I'm thrilled for the students and faculty of Yale's Institute for Sacred Music that will be traveling to Oaxaca very soon. So the goal of this webinar is to provide some historical and socio-cultural context of Oaxaca, and not only of the people in Mexico, but also to explain how its traditions continue to be practiced within the United States. So Oaxaca is one of the southern states of the Mexican Republic with the largest number of ethno-linguistic indigenous communities. What I mean by that is that Oaxaca has 16 formally recognized indigenous communities, and almost each community has various and many subgroups. So it's really important to note that each ethno-linguistic group has a distinct language plus their own local variant and social traditions. These languages are spoken in addition to Spanish. So many of the people in Oaxaca are bilingual, if not even trilingual speakers. One of the things that's really important as to see here in this upper image is that the state is administratively divided into 8 regions, which are known geographically as, when we see here kind of just a little geography lessons. This is the Isthmus, the Papulhuapan, the coast. These are in Spanish because this is actually by an artist that shared this image here for me today. We have the Mixteca, we have the Sierra Juarez and the Southern Sierra, as well as the Cañada and the Central Valley. From my understanding, I believe many of you will be spending quite a bit of time in the Central Valleys there during your stay. And the Central Valley is the home of the capital city and is the center of the political and economic power of Oaxaca. Within this, actually, one of the things that's really important is to look at, many of us may be well known with UNESCO, and Oaxaca has several sites that have been designated as World Heritage Sites, such as the Historic Center and Archaeological Site of Monte Alban, as well as the prehistorical caves of Yahuil, and well as the archaeological zones of Mitla, which are also in the Central Valley. To think about when were these particular two locations placed on the UNESCO World Site was actually Monte Alban was in 1987 and Mitla was in 2010. Even within these regions, and I'm sure you will see this on your trip, there are amazing markets and communities, vibrant communities that have each their own traditional ways of dressing and food. And so because it's lunchtime, I have omitted talking about food for right now, so that way we can look at some of the exuberant traditional festivals that are practiced within Oaxaca. Some of the most important ones that you would actually see in the capital city right now, or actually I should say last month, and during the month of the Easter season, is Holy Week, where there are different Holy Week processions. And one that's really important when I was there living in 2009 that I was able to see was one of the processions of silence. So for those of you that are also studying, when we think about religion and or spirituality, the different forms of religious musics that are played during this time, or the Day of the Good Samaritan, where those that are out will receive a refreshing drink as they pass by a particular stand. When we think of going through the calendar, I won't go through all of it, but we have Oaxaca, along with Michoacan, is also known for Day of the Dead. And as we come to the Christmas season, they actually have a tradition that dates back all the way to 1897 called the Night of the Radishes, where they depict the nativity scene. And all of these are done. I know this is a faraway image, but they actually take radishes and they're very ornate in terms of the way that they are carved. You have other celebrations such as the feast day of the Virgen of Soledad, the Virgen de Guadalupe, as well in December. But one of the other things that I want to make sure to talk about was in the Isthmus, we have the recognition of the Vela Muxe. The Muxes are a community of the Zapotec indigenous people that are considered the third gender and have become recognized and celebrated quite a bit throughout the entire state, if not in terms of even in California. And they're well known for the way not only do they take care of community members, but the ornate type of jewelry that is seen here. And so there are these very elaborate type of events that take place, celebrations that take place in the Isthmus as well as in the capital city now. And as you can see, Vogue has picked up on it, and now documentaries are being made. For the early music and organ aficionados, and I believe there might be a trip for you all planned for you all to see, but since 2001, there's an international festival that has been created, in particular, the honor of the organ. And one of the things is it was during the period of 1991 to 2001, 8 organs were restored and reconstructed and repaired. 5 of the organs were financed by the Banamex, which is the National Bank of Mexico, and the philanthropic efforts by music lover Alfredo Harp Helu. So once these beautiful organs were restored, they were rarely heard, right, or rarely played after the inaugural concert. So one of the things is after that, if you're not playing, if no one's taking care of them, they started to show signs of deterioration from the lack of use. So this is where the nonprofit came into play to help make sure that they would actually be accessed, and people. So through this organization of what's called the Institute of Organs, Historic Organs in Oaxaca, now there is an annual festival that bring in different scholars and or musicians to play. So I, incorporate some of these kind of the larger scale of what happens in Oaxaca. But one of The most internationally recognized is the Guelaguetza Festival, and this is celebrated in the month of July. And it's when we think about this particular festival, this image does not do justice to how big the auditorium is. It actually holds almost 12,000 people. It's always a little shy of 12,000, but as you can see from where the shot, how high I'm in, it's like there's 4 levels. So I was up on the higher nosebleed areas, but this is quite a huge auditorium where they celebrate the Guelaguetza. It's called the Máxima Fiesta Oaxaqueña, the maximum festival. So not only do you have this particular event that goes on, there's actually 12 other activities that happen in association with the Guelaguetza Festival throughout the city in this 2-week period. And some of those include the selection of Diosa Sentiot, which is the corn goddess. There are various convites, which are types of actually religious-based processions and would have different instrumentations based on the delegation of indigenous communities that are in the procession. You have also the legend of a Princess Donahi. You have a historical representation called the Bani Stuli Gula. And as well as now to bring in, when we start thinking about tourism, we have the Feria de Mezcal, as well as the Festival of Moles, as well as anyone who really there's a whole week long of food, people who like to eat food. So they called antojitos, little foods such as the tejate, the tamale festival, that all take place at this time. And so there's quite a bit of things to do. I know you'll be there next month, but for those of you at some later point in your life to return back in the month of July so you can see this. But at this point, as I'm giving you this kind of larger thing of what's happening in Oaxaca is how can these cultural practices that I've just finished mentioning travel along with the community members that are immigrating and settling in California and various parts of the United States, right? How do these traditions, these very important cultural traditions, get recreated, right? It's instilled in the hearts of second-generation youth. And one of the things is, so for my larger research, this is what I look at, is looking at how all of these traditions are being recreated. And I help to look at the why and how Oaxacan migrant groups produce these community-based events, such as the Guelaguetza festivals and or recreating the brass bands. And so, when we think about these cultural performances that represent not only Zapotec community, but other various indigenous communities, such as Mixtec, Triqui, Chinanteco, Mixteco, various. It's why they continue to exist, right? Beyond this US border. And one of the things that we'll look at is thinking about how there's a particular region called Oaxacalifornia. So in my book, I examine how new cultural practices shape the meaning and significance of the Guelaguetza Festival, right? And as a cultural performance, this festival can be found from the work that from starting since 2005, have documented 15 different locations throughout the state of California. And this is where the ethno-linguistic diversity, again, ethno-linguistic diversity can be equivalent to what is used in the United States as when we say native communities or nations. So how that display of ethno-linguistic communities are displayed through ceremony, music, and dance. And each celebration requires a myriad of networks, a lot of collective organizing among people, and transnational movement of cultural heritage from Oaxaca. So when I, titled this, right, the making of Oaxacalifornia seen through the expressive cultural forms of second generation Oaxacan youth, this is particularly based from a section within the manuscript, right? And this is through, I want you all to see, right, that culture is not static, that it doesn't just stay in one place, but how it can move and what the youth, second generation, even 1.5 to second generation, even third and fourth generation folks are saying through these testimonies, through testimonios, right? As part of my ethnographic work, right? And these bits of testimonies that you're going to hear share the complexity of what it means to be participating in transnational migration and the recreation of their cultural practices, and such as The folks that were interviewed are musicians, dancers, festival organizers, parents as well, right? In terms of thinking about what does it mean for them to see now their child participating. So I also consider that these practices mean what they mean to practitioners and organizers in fostering this idea, right? Or this, what we see de-territorialized space of Oaxacalifornia. And so one of the things that I want to mention, as you've just heard, just 3 ways of participating in the Guelaguetza Festival, but there are many other ways of participating. You can be a cook, you can be a vendor, you can be a volunteer, you can be one of the dignitaries, even being a spectator is one of the ways that you can participate. And so when we think about the complexity that festivals have, people can actually oscillate between several roles. Actually, Santa Cruz celebrated their 18th celebration this past weekend, and I think I saw in the participants, we have one of the Santa Cruz representatives here, so I want to welcome them and celebrate their achievements of maintaining the festival. But you see people going back and forth between different roles of not only helping to be an organizer, but also dancing on stage. So when we think about what are the possibilities in creating Oaxaca, California, there's many ways that this can happen. But what we see primarily within California is the Guelaguetza Festival being one of those, the kind of staples for this reenactment. And within that, it's not just a performance of dance and music. Each dance, each song has some sort of historical, even religious type of connotation or significance to that community. So those are, what are the stories that are being communicated within each one of those performances, right? So when we think of a performative aspect of dance, they tell stories about the Oaxacan community. And so those are the things that, for us to not go blindly when we just think of a performance. So the Guelaguetza in itself, right, as I was mentioning, also shows its resilience through economic instability and political conflict. But one of the things that's so important is the harrowing process of migrating in this transnational space, right? And so when we study fiestas, or myself, I look at fiestas because this is that encapsulates music and dance. It's because it's one of Mexico's most visible urban and rural community life features, right? It's the Guelaguetza, for instance, is organized to represent the most authentic representation of life of these ethnically distinct communities. So many festivals are framed and introduced so non-members of the Oaxacan community can comprehend what's happening. And the Guelaguetza Festival as a cultural performance allows us to explore the interrelationships and identities that are being generated and experienced, if not even communicated with the local communities. So when we think about these types of celebrations, they're essentially sites that enable community members to understand, criticize, and even change the world or their circumstances as a way for them to be narrating it. So it's really important to draw attention to how these cultural performances illuminate the symbolic construction of social life and how identities can be generated, if not even reimagined, by their festival participants. So that's just kind of like to give you that like heady, you know, kind of scholarly background, but I want to give you a little bit of the background of the Guelaguetza Festival. So it's necessary, right, to understand where and how this event came from, right? So Guelaguetza, within the very first top part here, is a Zapotec word meaning offering or participation in an exercise of a communal reciprocity, such as mutual assistance during a time of need or celebration, right? So it's an epistemology, it's a way of teaching, it's a way of knowing about collaboration or communal practice. And it's rooted in what is called uso y costumbres. That's what's known as customary law. It's an indigenous form of self-governance that dates back to pre-Columbian periods. So this system of reciprocity ties households together by creating informal social networks that cut across economic and social classes. So one of the things that you see here is actually, you see a historical kind of break of the images of the auditorium for the Guelaguetza. So this is one of the very first images. And then this one was actually when I first went in 2005. And then that other one was just recently. But just to give you a little historical here is, as part of the post-revolutionary project, the Mexican political party at that time, the PRI, began a racial discourse to create cultural and political projects where intellectuals and artists sought to articulate a distinct regional identity with the state's ethnic diversity. So Oaxaca began its own revolutionary policy of mestizaje, which was entitled the Oaxacanization Program. So in 1932, Oaxaca City celebrated its 400th anniversary. And this also marked the introduction of the Guelaguetza Festival as a spectacle showcasing the music and dances of Oaxaca's multiple ethnic populations. So by this time, this cultural production then accentuates Oaxaca's 17 indigenous ethnic communities through elaborate traditional dress, dance, and music, all in what is known as the Cerro del Fortín. So we start to see by 1951, the production of this once communal festival became organized and sponsored by the State Department of Tourism. 1969, the Department of Tourism reinvents particular traditions such as the corn goddess pageant to help to culturally enhance the celebration that is seen in Oaxaca City. So this is just a very brief historical summary to show some of the ways that the state has become involved in a communal festival over the years. And today the festival in Oaxaca City is an elaborate type of event that draws the national and international tourists to a very picturesque hillside auditorium. So once again, I bring in the question, what does it take to move a whole cultural practice and performance across a national border, right? So there were two migratory waves that took place within the, when we think about Mexico, from particularly and zoning into Oaxaca that came to the United States. The first one was with the Bracero program. This was during World War II. It was in the 1940s. And then again in the 1980s, due to the devaluation of the Mexican peso. So during these waves, the indigenous Oaxacan migrants in California began this very vast infrastructure of networks across here, what was the state of Oaxaca, through California, but now it goes even further all the way up to Washington and other areas. But one of the things that has been called and documented is Oaxacalifornia. And when we think about how this was created by Zapotec and Mixtec and Triqui, those were the first three major communities that came through for economic, prosperities to try to help better their situations. But in that, we start to see how different cultural practices, such as the Guelaguetza Festival, the Pelota Mixteca, there's a ball game that is played by the Mixtec community, basketball game tournaments, as well as the bands that started to become part of this when we see the movement of tangible and intangible cultural heritage from Oaxaca. And so, when I think about, and I want to emphasize that when one is creating infrastructures, it's not only just focusing on the material objects, but rather also the intangible, right? So how, such as music and dance group reproduce their different practices. So as mentioned here by the quote, it's this idea or concept of Oaxacalifornia was actually coined by the late cultural anthropologist Michael Kearney, who was actually here from UC Riverside, and to identify this third socio-political and socio-cultural and political public space, right? Where migrants had been coming through since the 1940s. And so this is really important to think about how the scholarship that first started addressed the social, civic, and cultural engagements of Oaxaqueños. And so this was one of the places that to think about how communities were being written about, but also what their contributions were on an everyday basis. So just to read the quote here is, yes, the first time I saw the word was in an article by Michael Kearney in 2012. At first, I had heard it in an academic context, but recently I realized that this word transcends academic spaces and is being used more in our communities and with youth. It is a term that allows me to express my duality as a Californian and of Oaxacan descent. So this is something to really think about in terms of how, from where this kind of connection between scholars and then community, right? Because that Kearney actually brought up the term since, I believe, the late, if I look at it, the late 80s, early 90s. And so how it became now part of the lexicon, the way that people speak. So the Guelaguetza in California actually started in 1987 in Los Angeles. And so these are some of the things to think about where the high concentration of Oaxacan communities were happening. So this is, one of the things that I want to also just look at is why would community members spend so much time? Why is it important, right? What happens also when immigrants relocate to new areas? There's racial and ethnic discrimination that Oaxacan indigenous migrants have experienced outside of Oaxaca, and it's been cited as one of the primary reasons for them organizing across ethnic lines and creating these pan-ethnic organizations. So it's in that migratory process coming into the US where ethnic identity is heightened, and it's used to distinguish themselves as Oaxacan people from other Mexican nationals and other Spanish-speaking groups. So what we see is the creation of hometown associations that help groups to come together and make these different types of events. So as I mentioned, each Guelaguetza festival is very dynamic because there's 15 that have been documented within the state of California, but each one takes this opportunity to kind of talk about, like, we'll see their own expression through booths, through community members that are there who are active, who are the active community members in that region, say Southern California, from San Diego to Los Angeles to Santa Cruz, even the Central Valleys, those that are up in the Napa Valleys. You'll see different representations of indigenous groups and how they talk and how they build and work for this one-day event, where in Oaxaca, it's the last 2 Mondays of the month of July, but here in California, it's typically on a Sunday. And, so they have it for one day because due to several factors, such as money, time, volunteers, you have to get city permits. Also the location of, is the location available? Did it rain too much? Are we in a pandemic, right? So those are some of the things that people are looking at. But for them to see the Guelaguetza Festival becomes a gift with a double meaning, right? In addition to practicing the redistribution of Oaxacan regional gifts, in terms of the performance, it's also an educational tool that challenges harmful ideas about indigenous people from Oaxaca while simultaneously becoming a site for ethnic solidarity. And it displays resistance against cultural erasure and the demeaning attitudes towards Oaxacans in the United States. And one of the 2 women from Los Angeles give this sentiment in the following ways, and they say, "We identify through our traditions. As a new generation, we must continue to cultivate the tree of our ways of life that our ancestors already planted." And this is very important to me because I saw and heard many young people rejecting their Oaxacan identity. Since then, it was very important for me to show that indigenous culture is beautiful and has to be valued. One way to represent my culture is through dancing. Especially during the Guelaguetzas, when our community of San Bartolome, Quilana, represents the Zapotec wedding. Also, every day that I speak Zapotec and wear part of my traditional clothing is a form of resistance and pride. So these 2 young women are individuals that are expressing the importance of being practitioners in their tradition. And as we see, one is a dancer, one is a dancer and a vendor, as well as another one being a musician. So when we consider these transnational movements across, international borders and the realities, it's how the second generation folks, if not third, navigate, right? And there's also pedagogical implications. It means the ways of teaching to the next generation. When we think about folks that come from the households, many come from mixed status homes. And what I mean by mixed status is not everyone may be a US citizen. Some may be in the process of gaining or soliciting that type of recognition. So it could be difficult for folks to travel back to Oaxaca. So then what are the ways then that people share these traditions, right? This is where dance groups and music groups become very important, because what we see here is There is sentimiento building. And what I mean by sentimiento building, it's the feeling, it's the sense of what does it mean to be Oaxacan if you're unable to travel back, right? So there's a lot of horizontal learning methods. And in terms of when we think about, in addition to having a partner or a peer or a parent teach you, but there's also a lot of visual recordings. And so according to Dr. Russell Rodriguez, anthropologist and ethnomusicologist at UC Santa Cruz, he talks about horizontal learning as when we think about all the dance group members are engaged in teaching one another in a continuous process, right? And this can also happen with music, where instruction involves teaching basic dance steps, how to listen to music, and how to properly wear traditional attire, even down to how to braid your hair. And that's one of the things that's very beautiful is you'll still see mothers and aunts and grandmothers that are available still there to help braid the young women's hair. A couple of just real quick quotes that I want to go through here is how some of the instructors, both men and women, have shared that, such as Eladio shares a similar sentiment as the dancer Violeta, where he says that the using of element of pride upon teaching of youth is very important. He says that when a young person reaches a particular stage in their life while growing up in the US, that they become embarrassed by their cultural heritage. Therefore, he advises that when this happens, additional engagement is needed to be done to make sure that the youth feel comfortable to continue forming part of their group and reestablishing desire and pride to dance. And so to have pride in your culture is very powerful. Likewise, a second generation youth, Janet, shares the challenges she faces as a dance instructor by the lack of daily cultural exposure to Oaxacan traditions. She goes, although they may be descendants of Oaxacan parents, some US-born children have difficulty feeling the music, right? And she believes that it's not the youth's fault, but it's because they're unable to physically experience the festivals celebrated in Oaxaca. So she asserts that sometimes there's sentimiento, the sentimiento is different. But when we think about in terms the longer they're participating, they can grow into that, right? So sentimiento building is very vital in helping youth connect with their traditions in their different practices. And as you know, the title of this slide, where we have Gertrudis, who's an instructor in Los Angeles, talks about different teaching techniques that involve the horizontal learning by watching and replicating each dance step or musical kind of instruction. And she says, little by little, they begin to learn as they watch. So, you know, when they see, it's very important that, you know, we're setting good examples, right? Likewise, from the Mixteco community of Santa Rosa, Rael complements the horizontal learning by saying the importance of visual recordings, as well as having nostalgic conversations with family members around can be another form of cultural transmission. So he says for him that when he and his siblings are able to talk and have their nieces and nephews around, it's that pride and gusto, right? The gusto of when they're talking, or if not dancing chilenas, that he hopes his nephew will observe and learn along with their elders in these convivial moments. So he says, you know, this makes an excellent point about how nostalgic remittance, how compact discs, how videos sent from the home community can actually help children see their roots. So when we think about how media plays a very immense role in the diffusion of cultural practices in California, YouTube, Facebook, homemade videos, or if not state-made videos and musical recordings have become very important pedagogical tools in teaching all of these different cultural traditions. So the internet has really facilitated a lot of access to this continuous flow of materials, right? So when we think about why they're important, so it's really like interesting to see all of this. I want to take you here so you could see this was a documentary that was made by a colleague, Dr. Patricia Alvarez, in 2015. And so that way you can actually get to hear the voice of community members.
La Guelaguetza en los Estados Unidos con el grupo Centeo, pienso que es un gran proyecto y que de esta manera estamos educando a mucha gente de lo que es Oaxaca y lo que tiene México para ofrecerle al mundo.
Este evento en general es muy educativo porque no solamente aprendes de una cultura, una comunidad, sino que vas aprendiendo de diferentes raíces, de diferentes regiones, diferentes bailes, y no todos los bailes son iguales. Cada baile tiene un paso que tal vez no se usan en ciertos bailes y todos tienen un significativo. Entonces, para que los niños aprendan algo, pues es algo muy positivo porque ellos están aprendiendo algo que para ellos tal vez lo gustarían en el futuro porque es una disciplina para aprender todo esto.
Costano High School has been a supporter of the Vive Oaxaca celebration and of the dance troupe for 6 years. The dance troupe practices here weekly. The staff here supports that group, and we believe that it's an important part of our school community and the community of Santa Cruz.
So this video is just a glimpse of the topics that I highlighted in regards to the vast orchestration that's needed, not only within the Oaxaqueño community, but also the local communities, such as with Santa Cruz and the school district. So this is part of the way when we think about how that creating of Oaxacalifornia is taking place and how it becomes an educational tool, not only for the community, but also for non-Oaxaqueño, when we think about US-born or outsiders. And this is when we think about that kind of like what's happening in that cultural exchange and enrichment, right? So, you know, this is something that is really important to think about. What are the effects, right, with the overall creation of a festival, right? I focused so far quite a bit on how the Guelaguetza Festival is being created and or dance groups, but what is a festival or any celebration without music, without a band, right? And Oaxaca has a vast repertoire of various forms of musical groups as well as musical genres, anywhere from religious to secular types of music. And so the reputation of Oaxaca, in addition to not only having an exuberant amount of festivals, and food, but also musical traditions. So one of the things that I want to kind of get to here is the rise of the philharmonic bands. Again, part of that historical, we saw in the 1920s, how fiestas and music were utilized to educate the people. So one of the things was also they had brass bands that were brought in. So we see a rise within the Northern Sierra region of Oaxaca, where a lot of community members shared with me, particularly they were in the ages of from the mid 60s to their 90s. A lot of them talked to me about how it was through the 1930s and 50s, bands were supported through the local donation of the residents. And they were the ones that bought the instruments. They're the ones that were doing all the teaching of the music. So to be a community band member was a very high and continues to be a very highly respected roles. And it's part of actually when they're part of a civic duty. And so they're part within their kind of like community service. So one of the things that's really interesting is that the bands were very significant, right, from the 1930s and 50s. And then, but as we get into the 80s and that devaluation of the peso, many communities saw a loss of the brass bands because there was a vast exodus of men, because these were normally male traditional spaces for men. They had to leave to seek out economic relief, meaning that it would leave many communities without a band. So Maestro Ismael Mendez, who was one of the teachers at the Center for Social Integration for Indigenous Youth, he states a community without a band is a community without a soul. And this was a phrase that continues to be repeated about how the importance of musicians, right? And it's not only felt in Oaxaca, but it's also felt here in California. And so as I talked about, right, again, pulling from those what's hometown associations, this is just a portion of a map that I've created where I have actually 40 different Oaxacan bands documented historically, but as of right now, there are 25. So one of the things, this is an area of Los Angeles where we see some of the earliest bands. And within that, these locations, it's located in Mid-City or Koreatown. And so one of the things is what you see in a way here is this kind of mapping as to where the brass bands are is almost an exact mapping of some of the indigenous communities. And so when we look at where are they practicing, how do they make their spaces, the things that we see is a lot of different community bands, such as Yasachi El Bajo. They actually, some bands actually dug out a space in their home, so that way they could have a band practice, or they rented a warehouse, like such as Maqueo's Music, and they would soundproof it with egg cartons. Why? Because when we think about these concentrated areas of Los Angeles, the cacophony of sounds, right, will draw unneeded or unwanted attention by police or maybe disgruntled neighbors, and sometimes they have become targets of violence. You know, what's really important to think about is, what do these brass bands mean for the youth in Los Angeles? And this is where, you know, we have the quote by Maestra Jessica Hernandez. She is graduated actually from UC Riverside in 2010 and was one of the first young women to actually obtain a University of California, any advanced degree in music, specifically as music direction, and then obtained a master's from USC a few years ago to continue. And so now she's actually doing like arts administration and accounting, because it's also important to think about, if you want a band, if you want a dance group, somebody needs to know how to be the administrator and do the type of like accounting. So when we think for them, why these spaces are so important for older generation, like her father and uncle, these were spaces for them for the men to come and desahogarse, to vent, to talk about. It was a space to maintain their traditions, but it was also a form of therapy. For the youth, they were started, the bands were started because of a lot of things that were happening in Los Angeles, gang injunctions and different forms of vices. So the parents wanted to not only continue to show their practices, but also keep them away from these different things that were happening. So for Jessica, as she says, ever since I was a little girl, I remember that my dad always played his cassettes of sones and jarabes and music of our town's band. And I remember listening to the music of Oaxaca. The Oaxacan bands were formed here in California for community festivals. It all started with music, and little by little, I learned about the town's dances, traditions, and customs. I try to contribute to my community by teaching and sharing Oaxacan music. As a director and music teacher, particularly when I teach children and young adults, I not only teach music, but I also tell them about the meanings and stories of Oaxacan music. What sones and jarabes are chilenas, boleros, and danzones, and the Oaxacan mass, right? Because they do participate in Catholic services and many others, right? She goes, and more than anything, I tell them to be proud to be Oaxacan and never to be shamed of being Oaxacan or playing their traditional instrument. And so this is something that's really just moving about what does it mean about, and echoes some of the earlier conversations that we heard from the dancers, right, about this importance. This was a video that I actually helped to create for fundraising, because for those that are able to travel, this community, some of the community groups actually are able to take the youth to the home communities for the Patron Days celebration. And this was a 2-year project of learning all of the repertoire for not only social dancing, but the religious forms of music that would be played at Mass, because for their patron saint. So I'll just play a little bit so you can hear the voices of musicians.
Esto no nomás es un hobby para nosotros, es nuestra cultura, es nuestra familia, es nuestra tradición, es lo que nuestros ancestros, nuestros abuelos, nuestros tíos han hecho. Nuestro proyecto es llevar a la banda, tiene entre 25 a 30 miembros para nuestro pueblo en Santiago, Xóchitl, Oaxaca. Lo especial es que aquí estamos todos los xochileños, la gran mayoría de los xochileños estamos aquí en Linwood. Y pues se inició desde el 2001, fue proyecto de mi papá Porfirio y de mi tío Moisés. Ellos fueron los fundadores de Banda Nueva Dinastía.
Fue hace como 15 años, en el 2001, y no había actividades de los niños, y decidimos mi hermano y yo empezar a organizar esta Banda Nueva Dinastía para que tuvieran algo en que entretenerse y a la vez conocer las costumbres de nuestros antepasados. También para mantenerlo fuera de las drogas, de todo eso, que antes no había actividades para los niños, no había muchas actividades y decidimos formar la banda. Este año vamos a ir con otra nueva generación, la nueva dinastía. No es fácil porque no hay fondos económicos.
Es muy triste, ¿verdad? Porque pues, todos vivimos en esa forma aquí nosotros. Aquí vivimos en una forma muy apretada, ¿verdad? No tenemos la solvencia económica como para darnos el gusto de ir y venir a cada rato a nuestro pueblo, ¿verdad? Entonces, es un sacrificio que hace cada padre para ahorrar un año para poder llevar a su hijo al pueblo, a Oaxaca.
Banda Nueva Dinastía se ha regenerado, pues. Esto es un trabajo de comunidad. Entonces, todos nos estamos apoyando para que sacar adelante esto.
Muy contento, no se puede explicar la alegría, creo que de cada padre lo que se siente al ir a Santiago, Xóchitl, y que los paisanos, los viejitos que viven allá, admiren a nuestros hijos tocando.
I'm looking forward to seeing my grandparents because I haven't seen them in a long time, and I'm looking forward to playing because I love this band and it's a tradition to my family.
I'm excited just.
So I'll end there on the cute factor with the young women. So by tracing the origins and transnational migration patterns of the Guelaguetza Festival, as well as the brass bands from Oaxaca to California and beyond, we see the complexity, the layers of infrastructures needed to create Oaxacalifornia. Thus, the Oaxacan community's acceptance of the term Oaxacalifornia moves beyond the academic concept and into one that's being embraced by deep cultural pride. Oaxacalifornia is a microcosm of migration route, not only of human bodies, but also of ideas, languages, and identities. So it was through these interviews that we first hear the challenges that first and second generation culture bearers face, but it sheds light on the different migration placements, their legal status as migrants, and their diverse forms of transmitting cultural knowledge, and for the following generations. So it was through these testimonies, right, these interviews, that communities members express their pride in having Oaxacan and Californian roots by participating in various cultural and civic activities. It's in this way that they create a bicultural identity that claims and constitutes their indigenous cultural citizenship in Oaxacalifornia. So with regard to pedagogical practices, educators highlight the importance of pride and sentimiento building for second generation youth. Furthermore, engaging in nostalgic conversations between family members detour feelings of embarrassment and strengthen their desire to participate in their traditional practices. So when we think of these cultural remittances, such as musical scores, traditional attire, that horizontal learning, audiovisual materials for educational process help to fortify the pathways for all Oaxaqueños in their lives. And so it's this migrant reality for many, and fortunately, they're contributing to the inclusion of women as musicians in bands, as well as youth being now the next generation of leaders. So it's through this statement by Yulisa Maqueo, Maestra Yulisa Maqueos from Maqueos' band, that succinctly summarizes today's presentation. With the company of Oaxacan community members, we can gather and feel at home when we celebrate patron saint festivals. We Oaxacans have established what is now Oaxacalifornia. How, you may ask? By celebrating our religious holidays, offering our traditional culinary dishes, our languages, our traditional clothing, music, dances, art, and much more. In sum, we greatly contribute to the diversity of California. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Chavez. That's fascinating presentation. I'm sure the applause are ringing out across the virtual spaces where everyone is watching this. This was absolutely fascinating.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, congratulations. We see your forthcoming book there, sure, on the screen, that I'm sure you must be very excited to share with everyone, and hopefully everyone's writing down that release date right now so they can they can get it as soon as it comes out. So we'll now shift to doing some Q&A. We have about 8 minutes or so. And watching the Q&A box here, if you're watching it and have a question to add, you can go ahead and do that in the Q&A box. Well, here's one that's come in. It's a thank you first for the rich presentation, and the question then proceeds: when Oaxacan communities reform in the U.S., how are the differences among the 8 regional cultures transformed and or amplified?
Really interesting question, right? So when we think about that, the state administrative kind of designation of those questions, or those regions, it gets replicated when we think about in the way that Guelaguetza gets identified or programmed for the presentations, as well as when we think about how many people will say like, well, what region where are you from? And some people will actually say in the way that they speak, soy de la Sierra Norte or soy del Istmo, right? So that is one of the way to say, just like the way we talk about whether we're from, say, I'm from the Midwest or I'm from the East Coast, and then you break down. But within that, what's also very important linguistically and through identity is someone will say regionally, and then they'll go to their hometown, right? And that supersedes even the identity of being a Mexican national, right? And this goes into further conversations about different types of racial discrimination that even happens in Mexico, right? So region and then the specific town becomes very important in terms of identifying and speaking about themselves. I think also those are the most visible ways, I would say.
Thank you. That's really fascinating. And here's another more general question for you. And the question is, how did you specifically come to study Indigenous Oaxacan traditions?
Thank you for that question. So actually, I have been working with different Indigenous communities for several years. One, I will say, just to identify publicly, I'm very proud of my own cultural heritage as being a bicultural, bilingual individual. My father was from the Sierra area of Chihuahua, and my mother is from native heritage of northern New Mexico, southern Colorado, which is Genízaro. So many people be like, well, are you Oaxaqueña or not? And so I make that very clear, but I have, because of the way I grew up, always going to different festivities where my father was from, and my mom, I grew up going to different either native powwows or to the festivities of my dad's hometown. And so that really kind of made me see the importance of why those festivities are important to communities. So when I did my undergrad and master's work in Chiapas, Mexico, and then when I went to Santa Cruz, I happened to was continuing to look at Indigenous festivals and was only looking academically so far because people said there's an event by the Oaxaqueño community, but my advisors were very much telling me like, no one has done this work. You have a vast repertoire of as a dancer and a musician to work with the communities. And lo and behold, I was what's known as in the Beach Flats, there was an event for the Day of the Children and the book, and the Santa Cruz community was actually performing. So I hear music and I go outside to the park, and that's where I went and introduced myself to the 2 leaders of the Santa Cruz community. And from there in that interaction, and I write about it, and I know they're present actually here today listening, is when they said, go to Oaxaca, go back, tell us what you learn, and go tell us what you learn and come back. And sure enough, I was like, I had a trip already planned, and I went and came back and actually saw them again at a Los Angeles event. And that's how I started working with the 2 communities in Santa Cruz and Los Angeles. And so ever since then, that was 2004, but really got involved by 2005. And I haven't left since, right? So when I participated with Santa Cruz, as you saw in the video, as a dancer, and I helped in organizing on different aspects. And then now with the brass bands, I sit among the ranks of the young youth bands and participate in various ways as well in that type of aspect. So it's really important because music and dance are, they're a pair, right? You can't talk about one without the other when it comes to talking about traditional practices, and each one has their own vast stories, as I mentioned. And book number 2 actually is all about the brass bands and the traditions, and as I call it, musical migrations, and how the youth have been able to access music not only in their hometowns but abroad. And so that'll be book number 2, also possibly with Oxford Press.
Yeah, well, fascinating. That ties into, we had another question. People are dying to know about your next project. And I guess if I could just tack onto that, I'm curious how the brass band repertoire, came to be associated with Oaxacan identity. And do you find the brass band repertoire with a lot of indigenous communities in Mexico, or is it specifically thought of to be more kind of in Oaxaca?
Oh, so the brass band, this is a great question. I love talking about it. So the brass band tradition actually, and we see that they come in from even earlier. When we think about the brass bands, historically were used during times of war, right? To announce when they were coming in, the troops were coming in. So we see that tradition. It was actually in Mexico, 2 presidents, Porfirio Diaz and Benito Juarez, actually of Oaxacan origin, actually brought in that tradition, a lot more of the brass bands into Mexico, right? But we see it significantly amplified in the post-revolution as they were pushing out the dictator Porfirio Diaz, and we see movements of different leaders, and through Benito Juarez, right? The bringing the nation together, the brass bands were brought in, and we would see them in the middle of the town at the kiosco, at the plaza. So hearing that musical tradition became part of the identity of that town, of the community, of the nation, right? But where we see the significant, and this is where the work that I talk about is, we see over 150 years of transculturation of, when we think of Western forms of music, like the waltz, the chotis, the doble pasos, polkas, but with indigenous instrumentation, one, right? Yes, they might still be Western instruments, but they're different instruments that are used that you don't always see, like the euphonium, the corno, and others. And I'll be talking about this in the University of Houston next month, about the differences in brass bands that we see in the US and here. But there's different instrumentations, but also in terms of musical compositions, right? You see different, if we're those who are analyzing music theorists, you'll see particular musical patterns, right? The beats that come in, the tempos. So particularly when it comes to sones and jarabes, if we were to do a musical analysis there, that's where we see a lot of indigenous types of rhythms coming in, but yet still utilizing Western, quote unquote, instrumentation. And so, yes, that answers the question in a big, broad way, but the bands are part of each community. It's like, and I think it's, if a band is still able, if a community is still able to have a band, they feel that sense of completeness, right? And people will say, oh, well, my uncle or my grandfather was from the band, or even now they could say, my grandmother was one of the founding members of the band in LA, right? And so it's really interesting to see that happening as well.
That's fascinating. And then is the repertoire something that is, something that's being repeated? Are there new compositions happening as well? Sorry if I missed that in your.
No. I didn't get into that one. But so this helps to build, right? So there are lots of particular standards of musical pieces. Like one of the standards we could think of is where Oaxacan contribution comes in, is with the danzón music, right? We know that comes from Cuba, but Oaxaqueños have become really well known for composers of danzón. And we think of the Nireidas, one of those, the very famous danzones. But yes, there are indigenous composers. I work with a lot of indigenous composers in Oaxaca, as well as here in Los Angeles. Again, as I mentioned, we'll be traveling with 3 other young, they're in their 30s, right? The late 20s, early 30s. We're going to the University of Houston because there is actually, it's called the Mexican Composers Initiative out of Dartmouth. So we'll be giving 2 days of presentations to talk about, one, pedagogy, and then musical transcriptions and arrangements. So we could teach to public educators the new forms of the standard and new forms of musics that are being created so that they could share with a broader audience. The young maestra Yulisa Maqueos has created a website that includes at least 2 historical composers like Macedonio Alcalá, who has Dios Nunca Muere, but as well as some contemporary living composers. So on her website, with Yulisa Maqueos, she is now creating an archive of different compositions for people to have access to. And so we're collaborating on how to get her in contact with many of, and particularly women composers.
Wow, fascinating. Well, you've not only sold us on your first book, I think now we're all going to be waiting for your next one as well. But I just want to thank you again. It's such a wonderful way for us to prepare to go to Oaxaca, and you've given us such a rich introduction to all these amazing forms of expressive culture. So thanks again for sharing this amazing work, and good luck with the launch of your new book. And we hope to see you again soon, sometime online or in person.
Hopefully in person at some point. Thank you. And thank you everyone that came to join us today. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Professor Chavez, and thanks to everyone who joined for coming along today. We did record this, and we're going to put the recording up online on the ISM's YouTube page, so you can go back and revisit this fascinating talk in the future. But that's all for now. Thanks, everyone. Stay well.
Thank you.
Thanks.